Hello, I'm Aldo. Welcome to Plays the Thing, the channel where I share my experiences prepping and playing tabletop role-playing games. This video is a third on my series on the Mavericks, which is the superhero role-playing game that I am running using a very heavily modified version of Champions Now. Champions Now is the superhero role-playing game written by Ron Edwards and published by Hero Games, and today is mostly a play report of our first session. Before we dive into that first session, though, I should reflect a little bit on what happened between what I showed you in my last video, which was a behind-the-scenes look at character creation for the game, and sitting down at the table and rolling dice. Between these two, we had the crafting of the now. And that's when I take all the hero sheets that the players have completed, and I focus especially on the situation sections, but also on the sheets overall. And I create a master document that brings together all of that information, as well as information pertaining to non-player characters, including DMPCs and villains, organizations, places, and other things and themes that might arise from the hero sheets. And that document is the tool that then I will use to run the first session. That document, by the way, is also modified during play. Then a new one is created for the next session, and so on and so forth. So for this particular game, that now generated a villain or two, a place in the University of Chicago, an organization, and that's about it. Now let me show you what happened when we hit the table. I'm going to do that by reading through the write-up that I worked on after the session. And once we get into combat, I'm going to stop reading and walk you through a blow-by-blow of how that combat went. Outsiders in a world that fears and resents them. Puka, Siphon, Rockpile, and Resin found each other in Chicago and banded together in fellowship and common purpose, striving to survive, but also to fight for what they deem is right, as the Mavericks. One day, in early May of 2024, the heroes were tending to their mundane lives when news broke that Israeli forces had killed a Palestinian metahuman and defender of Gaza. Already organized, student protesters at the University of Chicago intensified their demonstrations by planning a big anti-war rally to address the new developments in front of the Institute of Politics building later that day. The heroes became aware of these events in different ways. Cassandra Collins, who we also know as Siphon, and Pete Brown, also known as Rockpile, watched the story unfold on the television that played at the establishment where she tended bar and he washed dishes. Devin Vasquez, who happens to be a University of Chicago engineering student and also the superhero known as Resin, learned about the rally right before his 4 o'clock class when he overheard fellow students talking about attending later that afternoon. However, Saoirse Sinclair, also known as Puka, found herself right in the midst of the rally, as her guardian, Sister Agnes, had enlisted her help in staffing a first aid station that she and her organization were setting up to serve anybody who might be in need at the rally. After an hour of listening to speakers address the crowd, Saoirse saw a red, white, and blue clad man wearing a cowboy hat driving a van down a cross street to the event. Recognizing him as a cowboy, Saoirse cursed out loud, causing Sister Agnes to turn around with a raised eyebrow and admonish language. Apologizing with both hands clasped over her mouth, Saoirse stepped behind a hedge and teleported to the top of the building behind her. From there, she watched as the van parked a block from the rally and almost 10 cowboys emerged. Most notable among them was a man in a wheelchair, assisted by the lone black man in the group. At that moment, Cassandra texted her fellow Mavericks to ask if they'd been keeping up with news about the protest. Saoirse responded with a FaceTime request through which she shared footage of the cowboys gathering outside of their van. Alarmed, Cassandra called back to the kitchen, letting Pete know that the cowboys were on the scene. His face hardening, Pete dropped what he was doing and said, "Let's go." Their shift finished anyway. Cassandra and Pete hopped onto Cassandra's motorcycle and headed toward the rally. Meanwhile, with his class over, Devin was going to the rally when he encountered a different van at a crosswalk. The van had Fox News emblazoned on its side and Chase Sterling, an ambitious local reporter, in the passenger seat. Catching Devin's eyes, Sterling noticed the young man's disgust and gave him a smug smile just before the van drove away. Moments later, Sorsha watched from her rooftop perch as the various parties converged on the scene. First, just as protester Miriam Mansour delivered an impassioned critique of the Biden administration's support for Israel, the Fox News van pulled up about 50 feet from Sister Agnes's first aid station, placing it across the street from the protesters' impromptu stage in front of the Institute of Politics. Chase Sterling and his camera crew lost no time hurrying from their vehicle and setting up to cover the event. Devin arrived a few minutes later and slowly approached the Fox News operation to observe their event coverage just as the Cowboys got there and started fanning out through the crowd. Breaking from his buddies, the cowboy in the wheelchair and the African-American cowboy who helped him made their way towards Chase Sterling as Cassandra and Pete pulled up on Cassandra's motorcycle. At that point, the crowd broke into a mixture of cheers and boos as Miriam Mansour finished her speech and turned the stage over to Jamal Johnson, a young man who began addressing the crowd about the intersection between imperial foreign policy and bigotry at home, including recent spikes in Islamophobia, racism, and the demonization of metahumans. As the young man ramped up his speech, Chase Sterling noticed the two cowboys approaching him and turned his attention towards them, asking who they were and what were their intentions. The man in the wheelchair responded, introducing himself as Dan Martinez, a proud member of the Cowboys who, he explained, believed in keeping America human. As a veteran who lost the use of his legs when a metahuman terrorist, to use his words, attacked his unit in Afghanistan, he knew the dangers posed by metahumans more than most, and he was committed to ridding the United States of such monsters. Strong borders, he continued, were essential to this mission, as metahuman terrorist scum could easily infect the nation under the broken immigration system favored by the left. During the interview, Devin and Cassandra noticed that the cowboy who accompanied Dan Martinez looked uncomfortable, pulling his cowboy hat further down over his eyes, turning his face away from the camera, and making sure that his red, white, and blue bandana covered as much of his lower face as possible. Sterling must have noticed too, because he suddenly seemed concerned and asked, "Are your intentions here simply to exercise your right to free speech in the face of these un-American protests, or do you have something else in mind?" I asked because, what's up with your friend? He looks uncomfortable. "My God," he said, "you're going to attack the protesters." With that, the cowboy's discomfort transitioned to rage as metal erupted from his body, tearing off his clothes to reveal a cybernetic form underneath. Sterling stumbled back with a wide-eyed "whoa" as the man leveled looked like a wrist-mounted weapon at Jamal Johnson, who'd been sparring with cowboy hecklers during Sterling's interview with Martinez. At that point, the heroes jumped into action. So now we're gonna stop reading this write-up and get to the segment-by-segment walkthrough of the combat. And there you go. I've transitioned us to a battle map. This is a battle map that I created using Google Earth. I simply typed in the Institute of Politics address into Google Earth. It took me there. I then positioned the aerial view exactly as I wanted it, took a screen cap, ported that screen capture over to Foundry VTT, which I host on the Forge, and then I set it up with all the hexes and all of that, and a perfectly serviceable battle map is the result. Before we dive into the action, I'm going to try to orient you as to where everything is positioned. Let's go over to the selection tool over here, and I'm going to draw a box around the Institute of Politics. I hope you can see that. It's towards the right-hand side of your screen. That's the Institute of Politics. You'll note here that I've created a little rectangle that is the impromptu stage that the protesters have set up. That's directly across from the Institute of Politics, but still on that side of the street. You'll note that on the other side of the street, and I'm going to try to draw a box around that too, you have the first aid station designated. That's where Sister Agnes is standing, although I don't have a token for her. And then you'll notice that south of that, I've drawn another rectangle there, which is the Fox News van. I'm going to be zooming into some of these areas as we go through the combat. But one thing that I want to make sure we understand is I didn't want to sit there and populate this with tons of tokens, but this whole area is filled with people who are watching what's going on the stage. So I've only highlighted the combatants, but the players understood, and I understood as game master, that there were people all over the place here, which was going to potentially complicate combat. I'm not going to point out individual people until I zoom in on them for the combat. So let's just jump into the phases. In Champions Now, a turn has 6 segments. Characters go on some of those segments, but not on all. It depends on their speed score. Whenever they connect, that is their phase. We're going to start with segment 1. We have 2 heroes that connect on segment 1. They are Siphon and Puka. And this is what they did. Let's start with Siphon. Siphon is right there, if you can see her. And what she decided to do is that she was going to take a half phase action. She was going to fly to there, and from that vantage point, she was going to try to launch an attack at Vanguardian. Very specifically, what she did is that she flew up to that point, paused, and then focused her mind on the cyborg, trying to connect to his psyche so that she could drain his emotions and therefore his endurance with her vampiric drain. Unfortunately, when she reached out, there was some sort of neural interference, maybe because of the fact that he's a cyborg, that caused the kind of feedback, and she wasn't able to drain him. Now, that's not because he has a specific defense for that. It's simply because she failed her attack roll and therefore wasn't able to execute the attack, and that's how we decided to narrate why she wasn't able to connect. Next up was Puka. And Puka wanted to get to the stage over here, where I'm pinging. I don't know if you can see it, but she wanted to get over there to the stage because she wanted to try and protect the protesters that were on the stage. Now, the problem is that Puka only has a 10 hex teleport, her Fey flicker power, but it's only 10 hexes. So she needed to push her power for an additional 10 hexes to get there, which was just enough. So she appeared right next to Jamal Johnson. Unfortunately, that was a full phase action, so she couldn't take another action on segment 1. So now we jump to segment 2. And at this point, it is the cyborg's turn. You can see on the token there that his name is Vanguardian, but at this point, they didn't know that. They were just calling him the cyborg. So the cyborg had already pointed his arm at the stage, and right when Puka got there, he unleashed blaster fire at the stage. Now, at this point, Dan asked me if he could do something, and to be perfectly honest, I wasn't sure that Puka could do it. He said, "Can I abort my segment 3 action and try to push him out of the way?" Now, thinking about it, maybe that would actually be the function of the missile deflection component, which is one of the components that you can use to build powers, and she doesn't have that. So maybe I should have said no, but it made sense and it was cinematically feasible. So the way I decided to play that was that I said, sure, you can do it. And she pushed him out of the way, and I let her add her martial dodge bonus to Jamal's defense. So she did that. Unfortunately, the cyborg rolled incredibly well and hit Jamal anyway. He took a blaster bolt to the upper chest and shoulder area and fell looking in really bad shape. At this point, although it wasn't his turn to go yet, Dan Martinez, the cowboy who's over here, I'm going to ping him there. I hope you can see that. But he's right above the cyborg, standing next to Chase Sterling, who's the Fox News reporter. Dan Martinez was taken aback by his friend's actions, looked over, saw Puka, assumed that the cyborg was attacking Puka because there were these hated metahumans on the scene. And so he yelled out like, you know, "Cowboys, we have monsters on the scene. Let's give them hell." And he pulled out a handgun. And then all the other cowboys also pulled out handguns. And so now we had a little bit of an amped up situation. We're going to finish up segment 2 by talking about what Resin and Rockpile did. Resin was still Diego Vasquez, and he's standing by the Fox News van. He hadn't yet turned into Resin. So for his action, he slipped under the Fox News van, transformed into Resin, and then launched himself out the other side towards this cowboy over here. He hit and did knockback damage, which knocked the cowboy back several hexes. He fell unconscious near the stage, much to the dismay of the cowboy's girlfriend, who's the only cowgirl in the group. And so that was a situation there. And by the way, I just realized that I made a mistake. Resin should not have been able to act. And I'll tell you why, because Resin has the situation alter ego, and it takes an action or a half phase action to transform. And not only that, he wouldn't have acted on that phase because he has a speed of 1. I need to let Andrew know that that's going to be an issue in the future. And I don't know, he may want to get rid of the alter ego situation and just make this a special effect, the transformation. I don't know. I'll talk to him about that. Just note for the future. So if we go down the map a little bit, we see that Rockpile is down here at the bottom. And what Rockpile decided to do is pull a mask down over his face so that he can hide his identity. And by the way, I should have mentioned that Siphon did the same thing, because when this battle started, they were still in their normal ID forms. But anyway, Rockpile pulled the mask over his face, and then he used his lithokinesis to rip 2 big chunks of earth and stone out of the ground. Those, he lifted them from over here near Vanguardian. So probably 1 chunk from where I'm pinging right now, and another chunk from where I'm pinging over here. And what he wanted to do is use those to slam Vanguardian. Unfortunately, he also rolled poorly to hit. So what I described was the Vanguardian ducked under both masses as they collided over his head, and then he rolled forward and stood in front of Dan Martinez, facing towards Siphon and Rockpile as if he were protecting Dan Martinez. He looked to be kind of like shaking his head a little bit as he did. You know, he came out of like a daze when the 2 rocks almost collided into him. So that was the end of segment 2. Now we go to segment 3. Segment 3 began with the Cowboys, because the Cowboys are a hazard. The rules don't specifically say this, but I always have hazards go at the top of the round or the top of the segment, and they are a hazard. So at this point, the Cowboys pull their pistols and start shooting at all the metahumans they can see. They are, after all, an anti-metahuman group primarily. They have other interests, but that's their primary thing. So the way I built them as a hazard, and I did this for the silver shirts in the Sentinels of Justice game as well. They're built as an attack. It's a blast modified by the piercing and severe advantages. But one of the things that I defined about them is that a target of these attacks can avoid the hazard by making a dexterity roll. That's not standard for hazards. I understand that. There are 1 or 2 hazards that are pre-built in the rules that do use that mechanic. And most of the time, hazard damage just lands and that's it. But really, both for the Cowboys and for the silver shirts, I don't like the idea that their damage always lands for a couple of reasons. One, these guys are not particularly well trained. If I were talking about elite combat troops that should always pretty much be hitting, then yeah, I would do that. But these guys are meant to be a little bit amateurish in some ways. And also, there's something very satisfying and tactile about having the players roll to avoid the damage. I also have some other things attached to that where if you have it, you can automatically avoid the damage without rolling. And one of those things happens to be acrobatics. So the way that all of this went was that all of them made their rolls, so they avoided the damage. Puka in particular had acrobatics. So she automatically cartwheeled away from the injured Jamal Johnson, moved a couple of hexes, avoided the damage and landed next to the other protest leaders that were kind of like cowering up there and ducking to avoid the bullets that were flying around them. But Resin failed his role, and so Resin took a shot to the chest. Fortunately, Resin is built with some measure of resistance. He is this plastic, tough blob. So the bullet hit him in the chest, but he only suffered mild discomfort from it. After the Cowboys go, it was Siphon and Puka who got to go. Puka actually didn't get to go because she had foregone her third segment action to try to save Jamal Johnson, even though she failed. Siphon, however, decided to take the fight straight to the cyborg. She did another half move over to him, and then she struck him with a punch. It was a martial punch that was heavy enough, strong enough to like crack a brick wall. Unfortunately, the cyborg was unfazed by the blow, and he just turned around to face her, and we move on to segment 4. The cyborg acted first on segment 4. He returned the favor on Siphon, punching her with a very powerful punch that knocked her back 3 hexes and stunned her. She fell to the ground, prone, and trying to regain her wits. And that was the top of segment 4. Seeing that, we go back to Rockpile, who also acts on segment 4. And what he did is that he burrowed into the ground, and he emerged in his golem form, standing in front of Siphon to protect her as he squared off against the cyborg. While he was doing that, Resin approached the woman who shot him. She basically pulled out her pistol and said, "You hurt my man," and shot him in the chest. But like I said, it didn't do anything to him. So what he did is that he twisted his body into a tight coil and then released the tension and held out his arms so that his arms swung around and batted her. She flew back several hexes, knocking her into this guy. And both the cowboy and the cowgirl also fell unconscious all in a row there. So Resin had taken out a good number of the cowboys by this point. So that concluded segment 4. We jump over to segment 5. On segment 5, Siphon was recovering from being stunned, so she couldn't do anything. Puka, however, could act on segment 5. And what she did is she turned toward the protesters that were near her, said, "Take my hand if you want to live," essentially. They looked confused, but they listened and they took her hand. And then she used her Travel the Fey Wilds or the Fey Roads power, which basically is a teleport with the regional, with the expanded scope advantage on it. So she was able to basically pluck them all out. They all transitioned to the Feywild. To everybody else, they just disappeared in a blink. And she took them somewhere else. Now, we had to stop the game for a moment and look up how that worked, because I wasn't sure how long when she'd be able to pop back. And the rules say it takes 6 full segments or 1 full turn to complete a jaunt like that, which effectively was going to take Puka out of the combat. I mean, she did this on 5. She wouldn't be able to act until the next 5th segment of the second turn. I wasn't sure how Dan was going to take that, because he kind of would be out of the action for much of the rest. I am so happy with the way Dan handled it. You know, he made it meaningful by describing what it was like for that group of NPCs to travel to the Feywild, and it just made her seem heroic. And Dan also seemed heroic, right? So that was just really cool. But anyway, that's what Puka did, and so she was out of the picture. All right, so that was what was happening on segment 5. Turn to segment 6 and the end of the first turn. Van Guardian looks at Rockpile, sneers, uses rocket boots and rocket packs that he has embedded in his body to jump 10 feet into the air and come crashing down with a martial kick on top of Rockpile. Powerful, powerful blow if it lands. Fortunately for Rockpile, it didn't. Rockpile took a step back, and Van Guardian missed and landed right in front, or right in the hex essentially, with Rockpile, right next to it, and did so much damage that it created the small crater that he fell into, and he was kind of like buried up to his waist in rubble, but the crater was also big enough to send Rockpile kind of sliding into the crater as well. So now they're both kind of in there, kind of with Rockpile on top of Vanguardian. They're kind of a mess in there. Rockpile then lifts his arms and brings them crashing down on top of Vanguardian, who mostly avoids the damage by putting his arms up and blocking the blow. Not a special maneuver or anything like that. It was just a function of his high defense absorbing most of the damage. A little bit of it got through, but he has pretty high defenses, and Rockpile didn't roll particularly well. But nevertheless, there's powerful blows come down and kind of like shudder, Vanguardian's metal frame, but it holds. I should say, by the way, that before Rockpile brought his fist down on Vanguardian, Siphon was able to act. And what she did is, she'd shaken off the stun. She kind of got into a crouch, looked at Vanguardian, and tried her psychic vampirism again. And this time she was able to connect. She pushed past that weird interference, and she connected to his psyche, and then she felt the flow of heightened emotions like rushing into her, delicious emotions, not just rushing into her, but also empowering her. So her strength went from 4D to 8D. So she's now primed and ready for action. And it was in that kind of weakened state, right, that Vanguardian blocked the blow or absorbed the blow that Rockpile rained on top of him. I just forgotten to mention that Siphon acted just before Rockpile did. So at this point, Resin, if we turn back to Resin, he's taken down most of the folks on that side, most of the cowboys on that side of the street. And he also saw that Puka had saved the protesters, right? So gotten them out of there. So he decided that he was going to try to cut off the head of the serpent, so to speak. And he stretched his malleable body over to next to Dan Martinez and landed next to the cowboy and took his pistol from his hand and basically told him to tell the cowboys to stand down. This was a presence attack, and unfortunately, he didn't roll well enough to have Dan Martinez do that, right? It's in combat. There are a lot of negatives. He doesn't have a particularly high presence to begin with. Dan Martinez rolled well. So Dan Martinez does not consider the order, and he instead kind of wheels around in his wheelchair and orders his men to keep fighting, right? To keep fighting for the sake of America. So that didn't go as planned. So that was the end of segment 6. We're now going to jump back to segment 1. Puka is still traveling the Feywild with the protesters, so she can't act, but Siphon can. She is now coursing with the strength from the emotions that she's drained from Vanguardian. She, vampire rushes over next to Vanguardian, grabs him, picks him out of the crater with one hand, and then she flings him full force into the Fox News van. The Fox News van crumples around Vanguardian, right? Just like encasing him inside of it, right? And there's this loud explosion of sound and glass and debris, and everybody's kind of stunned by the effects of this, right? Dan Martinez yells, "Vanguardian!" in alarm as he sees his friend slammed into the Fox News van, and Resin aborts his next phase action to actually stretch his body out to protect Dan Martinez and Chase Sterling and any people who happen to be in the area. There are people who are, covering their ears, ducking. Some people take some mild damage, like bystanders take mild damage from the debris and all of that, the ones that Resin couldn't save or get to. And it's just this really shocking moment on the scene. I should mention, by the way, that the moment that Resin had stretched over there to where Dan Martinez was, one of the things he noticed was the professionalism and enthusiasm with which Chase Sterling was reporting on the spectacle that was going on. He had his news crew laser beam focused on it, and he was really hamming it up and giving like a really good thing. And when Resin noticed that, he also wanted to make sure that he was kind of playing for the cameras. Now, Andrew, Resin's player, very specifically said that he wanted to try to strike a heroic posture to kind of undercut anything that Fox News might be reporting about their actions here. So that all was going on. We go now to segment 2. Things are kind of momentarily quiet. Vanguardian would normally act at the top of this segment, but he doesn't move. Now, what the players don't know, but I know, is that Vanguardian is nestled in this crumpled van, taking a recovery because he has been sucking endurance with all of his attacks, and then the drain that Siphon did on him, that's really taking his toll. By this point, he hadn't taken a lot of knockout, actually, but his endurance was really suffering. So he was taking a recovery. So everybody's kind of like in this stunned silence. And then Rockpile at that point like stomps over to Dan Martinez, looming over him, right, with his great size. And he basically says, "Tell your goons to stand down now," right? And he has a much higher presence than Resin does. He rolled well. The situation was different than it had been a moment ago because of the actions that had just happened on the battlefield. So he rolled well enough for Dan Martinez to consider it. He's like, stand down to his men. Then we go to segment 3. So at this point, Siphon is looking at the crumpled van, and she decides that she's going to reach out with her psychic vampirism. She can sort of see parts of the cyborg's body, like, sticking out of the crumpled mess. She reaches out with her psychic vampirism to see if he still has anything left to give. And to her delight, he does. She makes the attack roll, and she starts siphoning his emotions again, and therefore his newfound endurance that he got from his recovery, and buffing up the dice that she lost in strength, because her dice diminish every round beyond the first after she's kind of taken in some extra strength. That's just the way that we built the power. So she replenishes her strength back up. And again, Puka is still in the Fey realm, so she can't act this round. And now we go to phase 4, or segment 4. In segment 4, Vanguardian decides to act. He feels his energy siphoning, and he pushes past that, and he uncrumples the van, and he kind of comes out in full Terminator fashion. At that point, Dan Martinez, who sees that, says, "Vanguardian, get out of here, live to fight another day." And you could see that Vanguardian was kind of like torn. He looked over at Dan Martinez, seemed to consider doing that, but then he looked over at Siphon and just leveled his arm at her and fired a blaster bolt at her. It struck her full in the chest, knocked her back like 20 feet, 25 feet, something like that, slammed her into the building behind there, and knocked her unconscious. Resin and Rockpile moved in and started to try to take down Vanguardian. They rained blows on him. Vanguardian managed to roll out of the van and avoid one set of blows from Rockpile. Resin struck him but didn't do any appreciable damage. Nevertheless, it was obvious that Vanguardian was straining to do these actions. Why? Because he was sucking endurance at this point still. Like, he's like basically at 0 endurance, and now for any action he is essentially eating into his knockout. So it was then at the top of segment 5 that Dan Martinez changed his tone and basically said, "Vanguardian, get out of here. That's an order, soldier." With that, Vanguardian seemed to respond to that command. He ignited his rocket packs and leapt over the buildings, out of sight of the cameras, out of sight of the heroes. That actually happened. In my enthusiasm here, I skipped over segment 5. What I just said happened at the top of segment 6. Something, however, could happen on segment 5, and that is that Siphon got her recovery. So she went unconscious, but on segment 5, she regains consciousness. That's how Champions Now is written, so that when you are knocked unconscious in the first time you're knocked unconscious in a battle, you can recover and come back to consciousness. The second time you're knocked unconscious in a battle, you remain down, right? So she recovered just in time to see Vanguardian leaping out of the field of combat. The other heroes were like, I guess he's gone. I guess he got away. Siphon was like, no, I'm not doing that. So she pushed her own movement to fly after him. And when she went over there, she saw him kind of stumbling, because again, he had to jump, he had to eat into his knockout. So she saw him kind of stumbling. He saw her, and we can drop out of combat at this point because he basically at this point tried jumping away from her again and knocked himself out in the attempt. So he arced into the air and then fell like a lead weight in the middle of the street on the other side of the block. And with that, we can go out of combat and back to just me talking to you. So Siphon went over to him, to Vanguardian, picked him up, went back to the scene of the battle, and basically dropped him in front of the camera crew, the Fox News crew that was reporting on the event. We cut over to Puka, who blinked back into this reality inside a Catholic church. Mushrooms and flowers and a breeze kind of like filled the space where she appeared, and the protesters came tumbling out after her. And Dan described what it was like to move through the Fey realm, moving through patches of mushrooms and flowers, and then hitting a kind of like a tumbling stream that ended in a waterfall that brought the protesters and her kind of tumbling into the church. And even though they'd just been through this, harrowing experience, they came out of there feeling a little bit dazed, but really kind of enchanted and overcome with this otherworldly kind of feeling. I rolled Puka's unusual looks and they did not kick in. So they weren't negatively disposed to her at that point. And, and she told them, you're safe now. I've got to get back to the others. And she teleported back. She blinked back to the other site. She was happy to learn when she got there that Jamal Johnson, who'd been injured by Vanguardian, was very seriously wounded, but that he would live. When she got there, the police were starting to close in on the area, and the Mavericks decided to leave. So she left too. The only one who stayed behind was Rockpile, who decided to use his lithokinesis to fix as much of the damage as he could around him. And of course, as he was doing that, Chase Sterling gathered his wits and his crew and came to him and started just like hitting him with questions about like, who were your compatriots? What were they doing here? Why were they spying on this area? Were they in league with the protesters? Like, what about all the damage that you've caused? Rockpile, very annoyed, turned to him and said, what's more important, your broken van or the life that those maniacs almost took? And with that, he kind of turned away from the news cameras, burrowed into the ground, and left the scene. And that wrapped up our first session of the Mavericks. Thank you for sticking it out to the end if you did. And as always, I wish you good health. I wish you good cheer. I wish you good gaming. Goodbye.